starving bear cubs appear in a snowstorm. The family they approach is left in tears. The wind tears through towering redwood trees, while snow piles higher with every passing hour. A lonely cabin's glow flickers against the storm, and at its doorstep appear two trembling bear cubs on the brink of collapse. What happens when desperate wildlife meets a family seeking solace far from civilization? Stay with me as we unravel a breathtaking tale of compassion, danger, and the unbreakable bond that forms when humans and nature collide. If you enjoy immersive storytelling and want to hear more gripping adventures, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Let's dive into the heart of the storm. The first flakes drifted down just after noon. At first, they seemed innocent, tiny, delicate crystals fluttering aimlessly through the mild winter air. No one in Redwood National Park had anticipated a full-blown snowstorm. The forecast had predicted only mild flurries, a dusting at most. Yet the old-growth canopy of the majestic redwoods did little to shield the forest floor from the swirling gusts that were soon to come. Mira Lewis leaned against her trusty 4x4 as she turned her gaze upward. She was in her early 30s, slim but strong from years of trekking the park's rugged trails. She had grown up near the coast, far from Redwood National Park, though she had always nursed a fascination with wild places. A year ago, she'd lost her father, her last living parent, to a sudden heart attack. The pain was still fresh, her guilt at not being there in his final moments burning raw. That day, she'd resolved to dedicate her life to something larger than herself, a commitment that in many ways had led her to become a ranger here. She found solace among towering trees older than human memory and in the presence of wildlife that reminded her of life's unstoppable resilience. Still, those clouds on the horizon unsettled her. They hung, dark and brooding, beyond the redwood ridgelines. She'd never known Redwood National Park to get hammered by blizzards, but climate unpredictability had been on everyone's lips these last few years. She could taste the sharp tang of the oncoming front in the air, a sort of metallic dryness that made her lips crack if she breathed through her mouth. She pressed her chapped lips together and checked her gear. She'd seen a few sets of tracks earlier, fresh bear prints crossing a trail near Redwood Creek Overlook. December was an odd time for black bears to be up and roaming. They tended to hunker down or slip into partial hibernation unless driven by hunger or displacement. Something had felt off about those tracks, and she intended to investigate further. Meanwhile, about 5 miles into the heart of the forest, a small family was settling in for what they assumed would be a quiet, technology-free holiday. Daniel and Rebecca, both in their late 30s, had decided to treat their children, Ella, 10, and Noah, 7, to a weekend unplugged from tablets, phones, and the bustle of city life. The older Redwood Creek Overlook cabin, rustic, secluded, and perched on a small ridge, seemed perfect. Daniel imagined reading stories by a roaring fire, teaching the kids to identify animal tracks, and glimpsing the star-filled sky without the usual haze of light pollution. Rebecca, on the other hand, came along half-willingly. She worked as a nurse and worried about emergencies that might occur miles from any hospital. Yet she loved the idea of bonding as a family in nature's splendor. She had agreed, albeit with some reservations. Unbeknownst to them all, nature had something far more intense in store than mere flurries. Within an hour, the gentle dusting turned into a serious snowfall. The temperature plunged, winds picked up, bending the thin-topped redwoods and sending torrents of snow swirling across the forest paths. At Redwood Creek Overlook cabin, the warm glow of a fire danced across wooden walls. Daniel had spent most of the afternoon chopping kindling and ferrying it inside. A stack of logs sat near the fireplace, promising cozy flames for many hours. He'd always prided himself on his self-reliance, though, truth be told, he'd never experienced a true winter storm. From the cabin's lone window, they watched the snow accumulate outside, blanketing the steps until the bottom few were no longer visible. Night would fall soon, and the winds howled with an almost primal moan. Little Noah pressed his nose to the icy glass. "Daddy," he said, "why does the snow look like it's moving in circles?" Daniel moved beside his son and let out a low whistle. Snow was whipping through the tall redwoods in eddies and cyclones, as if stirred by invisible hands. "That's just the wind swirling it around, Bud," Daniel said, an edge of concern creeping into his voice. Rebecca, perched on an old rocking chair, tried to appear calm. Inside, she found herself wishing for a more secure location somewhere closer to main roads. She knew, though, that they had come here by choice. It had taken them nearly 3 hours of slow, winding driving to reach the cabin. Even in good conditions, Redwood National Park's back roads were tricky. Right now, in a swirling winter storm, leaving would be almost impossible. She forced a small smile. "We're safe here," she reassured them. "The cabin's solid. We've got supplies." She neglected to mention that they only had provisions for a few days: canned soup, bags of pasta, some bread, milk and vegetables in a small cooler. She'd ration it all carefully if the storm cut them off longer than anticipated. Outside, draped in a swirling cloak of snow and wind, the forest shifted, alive with struggling creatures whose routines and instincts had been thrown into disarray by the sudden temperature drop. Among them were 2 small black bear cub siblings who had lost their mother earlier in the season, likely to a poacher or a car strike. Their mother's warm presence, her leadership in guiding them to dens and safe places, was gone. The cubs were alone, wandering, and in the face of the storm, dangerously close to collapsing from hunger and cold. Mira's truck crawled along a winding fire road that connected the main ranger station to a network of trails. When she finally pulled up near a heavily forested area, she switched off the engine. The sound of the storm enveloped her. Gusts rattled the vehicle. She scanned the swirl of white outside. This was the spot where she'd spotted a set of bear prints earlier, potentially a sow with cubs, or a lone bear rummaging for food. She had come prepared: thick parka, insulated snow boots, a backpack with basic medical supplies, and a tranquilizer dart rifle strapped across her shoulder just in case. Rangers never liked using tranquilizers unless absolutely necessary, but with the unpredictability of frightened wildlife, Mira had learned to bring every tool she might need. As she trudged into the forest, the wind buffeted her from all sides. It was disorienting to see these giant sequoias and redwoods trees that soared hundreds of feet above her, caked in flurries that turned bark and branches the color of pale frost. She'd lived through harsh weather in the region, but something about this storm felt especially aggressive. She lifted her radio to her mouth and attempted to call in a brief update. "This is Ranger Mira Lewis, heading west of Redwood Creek Overlook. Visibility is poor, but I'll do a quick sweep." "Over," Static answered her. She caught a few broken bits of her colleague's voice, something about a partial closure of the access roads. She tried to respond, but the storm's interference was strong. Communication was limited at best. If the storm persisted, even satellites would have trouble connecting, and the single landline at Redwood National Park's main station might become their only link to the outside world. Plodding forward, Mira followed the footprints. A mother's paw prints would typically be quite large, with baby cub footprints near her side. Instead, she found cub prints 2 sets by the look of it, and no accompanying adult. Her heart sank. Orphaned cubs faced near impossible odds in the winter. They would be forced to roam, scrounge for scraps, possibly approach human settlements out of desperation. She cursed under her breath as she thought of all the dangers waiting out here. The storm might bury them, or a pack of coyotes, though uncommon in this thick of forest, might sense the cubs' weakness. She hoped to find them, sedate them if necessary, and transfer them to a rehab facility. Lake Earl Wildlife Rescue, about an hour's drive north, had an excellent track record caring for injured or orphaned black bears. Mira pressed on, the prints becoming fainter with each passing minute as falling snow disguised them. The wind stung her cheeks, and the smell of snow mingled with pine and distant ocean salt. As the gloom deepened, she realized night was descending faster than expected. Concern mounted. If the cubs were still alive, they'd be seeking shelter, warmth, anything to stave off the punishing cold. Meanwhile, at Redwood Creek Overlook Cabin, the family huddled around the small table for an early dinner. The children's cheeks glowed from the warmth of the fire. On the table were simple sandwiches, tuna for Daniel and Rebecca, peanut butter for the kids, and some hot chocolate. Every so often, they would all pause to listen to the wind roar outside. Daniel placed another log on the fire, determined to keep the interior as warm as possible. Noah slurped his hot chocolate. "This is kind of fun," he said, eyes bright. "Like a snow day at home, but cooler. There's no one else around." Rebecca smiled at his enthusiasm, though she felt a twinge of worry. Snowstorms were pretty in children's books, but dangerous in the real world. She glanced at Daniel and caught the flicker of apprehension in his eyes too. They didn't want to frighten the kids, but the storm had escalated far beyond what they'd anticipated. Still, they had enough wood. The cabin was old but built well. They'd be okay if they stayed put. Outside, it was nearly dark. The swirling snow had taken on a greyish hue as dusk fell. Somewhere beyond the crest of a wooded hill, 2 black bear cubs struggled through the drifts. Their fur, normally fluffy and protective, was damp and weighed down by ice chunks forming along their backs. Their little bellies rumbled in hunger. One cub limped slightly, favouring a forepaw that had been cut on a hidden shard of rock earlier. The other cub occasionally let out a small whimper, as if calling for a mother who would never return. Then a light appeared through the trees. The cabin, flickering, warm, a beacon amid the snow-laden darkness. Drawn by instinct, the cubs pressed forward, single-minded in their desperate search for shelter and anything edible. Each step cost them precious energy, but hunger drove them on, urging them toward the glow. Inside the cabin, little Ella paused mid-bite of her sandwich and listened. "Mommy, I think I hear scratching," she whispered. Daniel's brow furrowed. Another gust of wind rattled the shutters, but after a beat he heard it too, a faint scraping sound, as though something was pawing at the wooden door. "Could be a branch," Rebecca offered, voice tense. Ella shook her head. "It sounded different," she insisted. A hush fell over the family. Daniel rose from the table and approached the door. He felt his heart race in his chest. As a city dweller, he was used to raccoons rummaging through garbage cans, or maybe a neighbor's cat brushing against a screen door, but this was different. The scratch came again, accompanied by a soft, pitiful whine. Carefully, Daniel flipped the metal lock and eased the door open an inch, the cold wind slamming into him like a ghostly wave. His eyes widened. 2 small, dark-furred shapes stared up at him. Snow clung to their ragged fur. Their eyes were wide, reflecting the cabin's light. They looked so thin, starved even. Bear cubs. For a tense moment, no one moved. Daniel's protective instincts roared into overdrive. This was a dangerous animal too, actually. But one look at their gaunt frames, their trembling bodies, and the scabs on their paws replaced fear with a surge of compassion. These cubs were obviously not a threat, not in this condition. They were half frozen, half dead. Rebecca hurried to Daniel's side, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Oh my God," she breathed. "They're so small." Noah and Ella huddled behind their parents, eyes wide with both wonder and alarm. Daniel whispered, I don't know what to do." Rebecca glanced at the children. "Keep them inside, far from the door," she directed, then eased her body forward to see the bear cubs more clearly. One cub let out a soft, almost squeaking growl. The other just blinked, its legs trembling. "They're babies," she murmured, fighting back tears that rose unbidden. She'd seen all sorts of suffering in her job as a nurse, but seeing it in these helpless creatures ignited a pang of maternal empathy she couldn't ignore. Daniel, with his body partially blocking the door, was unsure whether to open it fully or shut it. Logic told him it was dangerous to let wild animals inside. They could carry disease or panic and bite. But his heart broke looking at them huddled in the cold. "What do we do?" he asked, voice hushed. Rebecca bit her lip. "They're starving." They must have lost their mother. We can't just turn them away. She paused, feeling torn. Maybe we can make a space for them outside, under the porch? Or give them something to eat? Daniel considered. The kids looked on from behind. Ella's eyes shimmered, tears threatening to spill. "Daddy," she whispered, "we can't let them die out there." With a shaky nod, Daniel pressed the door open further. The cubs flinched, backing away slightly, then paused. Hunger and cold overcame any fear of humans they might have harbored. Rebecca turned to the children. "Stay back, you hear me? Keep your distance." She motioned them away from the immediate threshold. Crouching carefully, Rebecca ventured to the kitchen area and grabbed a bowl. She filled it with some leftover scraps, bits of tuna, a few pieces of bread, and then warmed some water in a shallow dish. She brought the makeshift meal to the open door and set it just inside. Instantly, the hungriest of the cubs poked its head forward, whiskers twitching at the smell of food, and stepped into the cabin, precariously crossing the threshold between the raging winter outside and the promise of warmth inside. The second cub hesitated, but after a moment followed its sibling. Both devoured the scraps in seconds, jaws trembling with ferocity. Up close their condition was heartbreaking. Their eyes were sunken, fur matted and patchy. One had a small wound on its hind leg, crusted with ice and blood. They couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 months old, a dangerous age to be without a mother. Rebecca instinctively reached out, but Daniel caught her arm. "Don't touch them," he hissed. "They're wild animals." She nodded, flinching at his tone, yet she understood his concern. Still, the nurse in her wanted to examine their injuries. This was the first time either of them had been this close to a black bear cub, let alone 2. Their hearts pounded. The children gawked from several feet away. No one noticed the tears streaming down Ella's cheeks until she sniffled softly. "They're so hungry, Mom," she whispered. "They look so sad." Rebecca's own eyes filled with tears at the sight. The cubs finished the scraps and began sniffing around, one settling quickly near the open door and the other pressing deeper into the cabin in search of more. Snowflakes drifted in from outside, rapidly melting on the wooden floor. Daniel had to decide, leave the door open and risk the storm's cold draining their precious heat, or close it and risk, well, the unknown. The cabin was not exactly designed to house wildlife, but to turn these starved cubs back into the storm seemed cruel. Before they could decide, a sudden howling gust slammed the door shut with a resounding thud, startling them all. The smaller cub let out a high-pitched yelp and dashed toward the darkest corner of the cabin, while the other froze, sides heaving with ragged breaths. A hush descended. The family stared, hearts hammering. Not far away, Mira was battling the storm, her flashlight beam bouncing off the drifting snow. She'd found partial prints that indicated the cubs might be headed in a southerly direction, perhaps toward the Redwood Creek overlook. She pressed on, breath coming in short bursts behind her scarf. Every step was a chore, sinking into fresh drifts up to her calves. Her mind wandered to previous rescues, orphaned opossums clinging to a dead mother's side, a fawn caught in a barbed wire fence, an eagle that had broken its wing in a windstorm. Sometimes Mira had been able to save them, ferrying them to Lake Earl Wildlife Rescue, or a veterinarian who specialized in wildlife medicine. Other times, like with the baby coyote she'd found too late, she'd only been able to provide a decent burial. The memory of those small, lifeless eyes still haunted her. The thought of losing these cubs pressed her forward through the storm, despite the biting cold that made her fingers stiff even inside gloves. After a while, the lights from the cabin came into view, a faint glow through dense trunks and swirling snow. Mira realized that the Redwood Creek overlook cabin was occupied. She recalled hearing that a family had reserved it for the weekend. Her heart quickened. If the cubs had any sense, they might have headed toward that light, just as a moth is drawn to a flame. She forced her body to move faster, though the wind fought her every step. Snow clung to her eyelashes, and her toes began to numb. A glimmer of relief swept through her. If the cubs had indeed found that cabin, there was a chance they were safe from immediate peril. but that also meant she needed to hurry. The average family on vacation had no training in handling frightened wildlife, and a cornered or injured bear could be dangerous, even a cub. Not to mention the myriad diseases that can pass between wildlife and humans, or the potential for accidental harm. She had to reach them before anything tragic happened. As she approached, she realized the family inside had no way to predict that help was coming. The wind whistled through the giant redwoods, dislodging heavy clumps of snow from branches above that crashed to the ground like small avalanches. She raised her arm to shield her head. The entire forest groaned under the weight of the storm. Finally, the shape of the cabin took form. It was a modest structure, a single story with a peaked roof, coated in a thick layer of white. The windows glowed orange against the swirling darkness. Mira trudged up to the small porch, noticing footprints in the snow paw prints, fresh ones, with melted shapes around them, as if the cubs had lingered here. Her heart pounded. She tried the door, found it latched, and knocked firmly. Over the wind, the knocks might have sounded faint, but she kept knocking, hoping someone inside would hear. Inside, the family was in mid-discussion about what to do with the cubs. Daniel had managed to coax the more timid one from the corner with a few more scraps of food. Both cubs were huddled near the fire, wary but drawn by the warmth. Rebecca had closed off the children's bedroom, instructing Ella and Noah to stay inside and lock the door if anything went wrong. The children obeyed, albeit reluctantly, peeking out now and again from the cracked doorframe. Suddenly, sharp raps at the front door. Everyone froze. Daniel's initial thought was that perhaps the mother bear had returned. A moment later, he realized how irrational that sounded. Bears didn't knock. More likely it was a park ranger or another stray traveler seeking refuge. He slowly advanced and cracked the door open. Mira stood on the other side, snow clinging to her entire figure. With relief flooding her voice, she said, "Thank goodness. I'm Ranger Mira Lewis. Mind if I come in?" Daniel saw the official park ranger badge on her heavy coat. "Yes, of course, come in," he said, stepping aside. Mira stumbled in, shaking off snow in clumps that quickly melted on the floor. The warmth of the cabin felt heavenly against her frozen cheeks. She took a moment to catch her breath, pushing back her hood to reveal wind-tangled hair that stuck to her forehead. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on the two trembling bear cubs near the fireplace. A wave of emotion flickered across her features, relief that they were alive, concern at their condition. "You found them," she said softly, moving closer. She kept a cautious distance, not wanting to startle the animals. "I've been tracking them for hours. They're orphaned." Daniel gave a tight nod, explaining how they'd shown up desperate and starved. "We didn't know what else to do," he said. "We gave them some scraps. We couldn't turn them away." Rebecca spoke up, arms folded. "Can they make it? Are they going to be okay?" Mira knelt, mindful of the cubs' body language. They were extremely skittish. One flinched when she gently reached out a hand. In the dancing firelight, the cub's condition was even more apparent, ribs visible, fur ragged, eyes dull. She frowned. "They're in rough shape. They need proper treatment at a rescue center. Lake Earl Wildlife Rescue is the best bet nearby." But in this storm, her sentence trailed off. They all knew what it meant. With roads iced over or blocked by fallen branches, getting the cubs to a facility that night was impossible. Mira's mind raced, considering their options. The family eyed her, waiting for direction. "They need warmth and fluids," Mira concluded. "And food, but not too much at once, or they'll get sick." She glanced around. The cabin was small, offering limited space. "For now, it's safer to keep them inside until morning. But we have to be extremely careful. They're still wild. And if they panic—" Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "All right. Whatever you say, Ranger. Just tell us how we can help." Mira set down her pack. "I have some veterinary gloves, a small kit of antibiotics and salve. I can examine their wounds. Once they're stabilized, we'll see about the roads come daybreak." Rebecca exhaled. The tension in the cabin was thick, but there was also a note of hope. The kids peeked out from their hiding spot again, eyes wide. Ella mustered the courage to ask, "Are they going to live, Ranger?" Mira gave the girl a reassuring nod. "We're sure going to do our best to make sure they do." The storm raged on outside, a constant roar. Occasionally the family heard the sound of cracking branches under the weight of heavy snow. Inside, the energy was different now, a hushed collaboration, a sense of unity among strangers bound together by circumstances and the shared mission of helping these fragile lives. Mira applied salve to the wounded cub's forepaw and hind leg, clucking her tongue sympathetically at each twinge of pain the cub displayed. Both cubs were too exhausted to resist much. Rebecca fetched a few thick towels from a closet. She and Mira dried off the cubs as best they could, carefully removing ice chunks from their fur. Daniel lit a lantern to augment the flickering firelight, giving them a clearer view. "They're so small," he observed softly, voice tight with emotion. Mira nodded. "They're under a year. They'd normally rely on their mother's den for safety this time of year. Without her, they've been wandering. Probably haven't eaten decently in days. It's a miracle they found you." Ella and Noah pressed close to their mother, watching with tear-streaked faces. Rebecca allowed them a brief look, kneeling with her arms around them. "They're going to get better," she whispered, more a reassurance to herself than anyone else. Still trembling from adrenaline and leftover fear, Daniel gently asked, "What happened to the mother, do you think?" A sadness flickered in Mira's eyes. Could be anything. A car strike, a poacher, or maybe a fight with another bear. We lose a few black bears every year to collisions on Route 101 nearby, especially when they wander for food. She sighed, the weight of it settling in. But right now, let's focus on these two. Another hour crept by. The family rummaged their supplies to provide a modest meal for the cubs, some soft bread, water, and a bit of leftover meat. Mira warned them repeatedly about the dangers of feeding wildlife. Under normal circumstances, encouraging a bear to rely on human food is dangerous for both humans and the animal. But these were desperate times, and the survival of these cubs hinged on short-term nourishment. Mira also gave the family critical advice. Don't let them get comfortable approaching people. We have to keep our distance as much as possible, while still ensuring they get what they need tonight. Once the storm breaks, we'll call for a rescue truck. They can be sedated, transported to Lake Earl, and hopefully rehabilitated. Rebecca saw the logic, but the tears in her children's eyes, whenever she told them to step back, tugged at her heart. They wanted to hold and comfort the cubs like lost puppies. From a nurse's perspective, Rebecca understood that letting wild animals get too familiar with humans can be a death sentence once they're released back into the wild, if they got released at all. Finally, as midnight approached, the group set up a small corner by the fireplace. Mira used blankets to block off the kitchen, effectively corralling the cubs in one cozy area. The family would sleep in shifts to ensure nothing went awry. Daniel volunteered to stay up first, stoking the fire to keep the cabin warm. He insisted Rebecca and the kids catch some sleep. Mira, her body aching from the day's exertion, also needed rest, but she settled onto the couch, half awake, listening for any sign of distress. Through the small window, she glimpsed the swirling snow reflecting what little light remained from the cabin. Memories of her father's final days crawled to the forefront of her mind. She fought them back. Not now, she told herself. She pressed a palm against her chest, feeling the slow, steady thump of her own heart, and realized that in caring for these cubs, she was healing something within herself. She'd blamed herself for not being there when her father died, for not saving him. But life had a way of reminding you that not all losses can be prevented. Sometimes the best you can do is help whoever crosses your path, and in doing so, heal your own grief. Exhausted, Mira drifted into a light doze, lulled by the crackle of the fire and the muffled roar of the wind. They woke to the crash of a giant branch slamming down on the roof. Everyone bolted upright in terror. Daniel grabbed a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trembling ceiling. Snow and debris slid down, rattling the metal roof like thunder, but it held firm. The kids, who'd huddled in bed, screamed and rushed out to their parents. The cubs startled awake, scampering in small circles, their claws clicking on the floor. Mira sprang to her feet, heart pounding, and surveyed the damage. The cabin's roof was intact, though battered. A narrow leak had sprung near the chimney. Water dripped onto the stones of the hearth, hissing occasionally when it splattered near the fire. "Everyone okay?" she gasped, adrenaline spiking. Daniel nodded shakily. He ushered Ella and Noah into the living area. Rebecca wrapped them in blankets. Outside, the storm howled even more fiercely than before. Snow hammered the windows, and a frigid draft seeped through unseen cracks in the cabin's old wood. Mira tried her radio once more, but all she got was static. "Do you think we can get out of here?" Daniel asked, voice trembling. "If the roof collapses or something?" Mira frowned. "The roads might be impassable, and traveling on foot in this storm is too dangerous, especially with children." She cast a worried glance at the cubs, who cowered together in the corner, panting. "We need to wait it out." Rebecca's voice shook. "How much longer do you think that'll be?" "I'm not sure," Mira admitted softly. "Could be a few hours, could be the rest of the day." She paused. "Let's keep everyone calm. Keep the fireplace going, but not too big. You don't want to stress the chimney. If we have to, we can move to the center of the cabin, away from the edges." A tense hush settled. The kids clung to their parents, eyes wide with fear. Yet, amidst the gloom, a strange sense of camaraderie bloomed. They were in this together, the 4 family members, the ranger, and 2 orphaned cubs. After ensuring the immediate danger had passed, they resumed the routine of caring for the cubs. Mira reapplied ointment to the one's wounded paw, noticing with cautious optimism that the swelling had subsided a bit. Their eyes were brighter, coats a little drier, though they still appeared exhausted and undernourished. Ella and Noah were fascinated. They hovered, whispering to each other about the way the cubs licked their chops or blinked in the firelight. Daniel, seeing the children's awe, softened his stance about them being close. "Just don't touch them," he reminded gently. Rebecca prepared a small pot of oatmeal, feeding the cubs tiny spoonfuls in a shallow bowl. The animals devoured the warm meal. While the storm raged, an emotional thaw took place inside the cabin. The presence of these helpless creatures reminded each person of the fragility of life and the power of compassion. With the roof still intact and the storm raging outside, the cabin settled into a tense but steady rhythm. Periodically, Daniel and Rebecca would check for leaks or structural damage. Mira dozed in short bursts, always alert for new trouble. Ella and Noah, despite being frightened, found moments to play with each other, whispering jokes or making shadow puppets against the cabin wall, as if they were trying to cheer up the bear cubs. When morning came, though, it was hard to tell with the sky. A perpetually swirling mass of white. Mira mustered her courage and ventured outside briefly to see if there was any chance of clearing a path. She returned quickly, caked in fresh snow, shaking her head. "It's no use. We're snowed in." Rebecca's face fell. "We only have so many supplies," she murmured. "The kids can't eat much more dry cereal and canned beans." "And what about the cubs?" Mira rested a gloved hand on Rebecca's shoulder, trying to be reassuring. "We'll ration carefully. I'll see if I can melt snow for water. If we have to, I know some basic foraging techniques, though pickings will be slim in winter." Daniel, however, seemed on edge. "I'm worried about the chimney," he said. "The fire's our only heat source, but if something happens to the chimney, we'll freeze." Mira nodded. She understood. Redwood National Park rarely saw storms of this magnitude, but here it was, and they were ill-equipped. Time drifted slowly. Each hour felt like an eternity. The kids grew restless, fidgeting in the small cabin. They kept asking if they could go out and play in the snow, but Daniel firmly said no, it was too dangerous. And so tensions ran high, though the presence of the cubs provided a strange comfort, giving everyone something to focus on besides their own predicament. As the day wore on, Mira noticed a growing sense of camaraderie with the family. Daniel shared funny stories about his job in tech, confessing that he felt burned out and wanted to find a deeper meaning in life, hence the idea of a family retreat in nature. Rebecca opened up about her experiences as a nurse, how she'd encountered life and death so often that it sometimes haunted her dreams. They laughed, too, at silly anecdotes from the kids or memories from their past. Although the storm raged in that small refuge, they forged bonds reminiscent of long-time friends. At one point, Ella asked Mira about her life as a ranger. Mira paused, reflecting on her father. "I used to have a desk job," she revealed quietly, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "But after I lost my dad, something shifted. I realized life's too short. I wanted to do something that mattered to me, something that felt purposeful. So I moved here." She gestured toward the window, the swirl of white beyond. "It's not always easy, and sometimes it's lonely. But seeing creatures like these cubs alive and well, that's worth it to me." The kids listened, wide-eyed, as if a world of possibilities had opened up to them. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, and Rebecca, eyes glistening, placed a reassuring hand on Mira's shoulder. Unbeknownst to them, the starved and injured bear cubs that had stumbled to their door the night before were now forging a bridge between their hearts, reminding each person of the value of compassion and unity against the raw forces of nature. By late afternoon, the storm showed little sign of relenting. The winds occasionally dipped, lulling them into a false sense of calm, only to surge again. The snow outside was waist-deep in places, creating towering drifts around the cabin. Small animals that typically roamed the park were nowhere to be found. They had either hunkered down or fled. It was eerily silent, except for the unceasing wind. Mira suggested they try to preserve firewood. "We're running low," she explained. "We might need to chop more, but that means going outside in these conditions." Daniel frowned. He knew the family had planned for a short stay, so he hadn't chopped enough wood for multiple days of continuous burning. They took stock of what remained, only enough for another 24 hours, maybe less if the temperature continued to plummet. It was unthinkable to let the fire die. "I'll go," Daniel said resolutely. "At least try to gather some branches from around the cabin. Maybe there's a downed tree we can chop up." He looked at Mira. "Can you come with me? We'll be safer as a pair." Mira agreed, though she was worried about the risk. "We'll keep it short," she said. "Rebecca, keep an eye on the cubs and the kids." Rebecca nodded, biting her lip nervously. Venturing out was harrowing. The wind cut like a knife, and in some places the snow reached Mira's knees. Daniel slipped multiple times on hidden ice, cursing under his breath, but pressed on. They circled the cabin carefully, scouting for fallen branches. Indeed, the large limb that had crashed onto the roof was now lying broken in two on the ground. Most of the weight had slid off, but smaller pieces could be salvaged for firewood. Mira gave Daniel a handsaw from her pack. Working together, they broke down what they could. Fingers quickly numbed, and the simple task of hauling branches became an ordeal. Each breath was an icy jolt. Mira's cheeks burned from the cold. The swirling wind filled her ears, muffling Daniel's words. At one point, he stopped, leaning on the saw. "This is insane," he rasped. "I had no idea Redwood National Park could get hammered like this." Mira nodded, her words snatched by the gale. They had gathered enough branches to last the night, hopefully. With numb hands, they dragged the bundle back to the cabin. Rebecca opened the door for them, and they stumbled inside, relief flooding their bodies as soon as the warmth of the fire embraced them. Snow clung to their coats, quickly melting into puddles on the wood floor. Rebecca helped them remove their gear, and the children gazed at their father with wide-eyed admiration, as if he were a hero returning from a quest. The cubs, nestled in the corner, perked up at the commotion before settling back down, exhausted. Daniel flashed a weary smile at his family. "We got some wood," he said simply, chest heaving. Mira's teeth chattered as she tried to calm her racing heartbeat. The near-zero visibility and howling gusts had rattled her, but they were safe now, at least for the moment. She looked at the exhausted, grateful faces around her, Rebecca, Daniel, Ella, and Noah. She found herself silently thanking the storm, bizarrely enough, for making her realize just how crucial connection was in times of adversity. Every survival story she'd read or witnessed hinged on cooperation. Night fell once more, but this time there was the faintest hint that the storm might be diminishing. The wind still howled, though not as violently as before. The constant flurries seemed thinner, letting an occasional sliver of moonlight escape. The cabin settled into darkness, illuminated by the glow of the lantern and the flames. Mira slept for a couple hours while Rebecca and Daniel kept watch. She dreamt of her father. He was teaching her how to fish, just as he used to when she was small. She woke with tears in her eyes, heart aching. But the moment she sat up and saw the sleeping family and the dozing cubs, she understood that she was, in a sense, living out what her father had taught her, to care, to protect, to steward life where she could. In the early hours, Mira tried her radio again. For a moment she heard static, then a faint voice. She jolted upright. "Hello, this is Ranger Mira Lewis at Redwood Creek Overlook." Over, silence, followed by more static. Then a crackling voice. "Roads block rescue tomorrow, over." Mira's heart soared. Even though it was just a fragment of a message, it implied that help might come in the morning if the roads were cleared enough. She repeated her location, requesting immediate assistance for 2 orphaned bear cubs and a stranded family. No further reply came, but it was something. She approached the sleeping form of Daniel and gently woke him, explaining what she'd heard. A weary smile broke across his face. "Tomorrow," he murmured, hope gleaming in his eyes. By dawn, an ashen dawn, but lighter than the all-encompassing night that had cloaked them, the wind had died down to a whisper. Snow still fell, but softly. Daniel and Mira decided to see if there was a vantage point from the ridge behind the cabin to confirm whether plows or ranger vehicles were anywhere in sight. Rebecca stayed inside to care for Ella, Noah, and the cubs. They trudged up a small slope behind the cabin, clinging to branches and boulders for balance on the slick ground. The world was astonishing in its transformed state. Every tree, every rock was swaddled in white. The redwoods, so stately, now wore thick mantles of snow, bending under the weight. The hush was profound. Even the local birds seemed reluctant to break the silence. Upon reaching the top, Daniel and Mira surveyed the valley below. She raised her binoculars, scanning for movement. At first, there was only a vast expanse of powder. Then, along a distant ribbon of road, she glimpsed what could have been the shape of a plow or a ranger's truck pushing through. She couldn't be sure. Still, it filled her chest with a wave of relief. "They'll find us," she said, lowering the binoculars. "It might take a few hours, but they'll come." Daniel exhaled, tension bleeding from his stance. "I'm glad." Then, with a shy gratitude, he turned to Mira. "Thank you for everything." She nodded, expression sincere. "We're in this together." Back in the cabin, the bear cubs had stirred, sniffing around for food. Rebecca gave them the last of the oatmeal and some tiny scraps of bread. She worried about what they'd do if help didn't arrive soon. These cubs needed a vet's care, and they couldn't thrive on meager scraps forever. Still, they looked stronger than before, eyes more alert, and the wounded paw seemed less swollen. Ella and Noah huddled close, quietly observing. They had each grown attached to the cubs in their own way. Noah, ever the imaginative child, whispered that he'd name them Snowy and Stormy. Rebecca gently reminded him that wild animals aren't pets and that they'd soon be taken to a special center where experts could help them get back to living in the wild. "But we can visit them, right?" Noah asked, eyes shining. "At Lake Earl Wildlife Rescue." Rebecca smiled, ruffling his hair. "We'll see." Time dragged. Mira and Daniel returned. Everyone took turns nibbling on the rationed food. The tension was palpable, but so was a growing optimism. The storm had weakened. The roads might be cleared soon. All they had to do was wait. Morning shifted into midday. The sky lightened further, although thick clouds still blanketed the horizon. Then around lunchtime, a new sound broke through the hush of snow and engine, far off but steadily growing louder. Daniel froze, exchanging a hopeful glance with Rebecca. Ella and Noah perked up, excitement dancing in their eyes. Mira grabbed her radio. "This is Ranger Mira Lewis at Redwood Creek Overlook. We can hear you." "Over, static." Then a crackled reply. "Ranger Lewis, this is Redwood Station. We're en route." "Over." Relief flooded the cabin. They rushed to the window, wiping fog from the glass. Through a break in the trees, they saw a pair of headlights inching through the drifts. Mira hurried outside, waving a bright orange cloth to draw attention. The truck slowly advanced, tires wrapped in heavy chains, accompanied by a second vehicle that appeared to be for wildlife transport. The cavalry had arrived. The rescue team poured into the cabin, another park ranger and a wildlife rehabilitation specialist from Lake Earl named Dr. Miller. They wasted no time in examining the cubs, scanning for injuries, measuring their vitals, gently administering sedatives. All the while, the family looked on, a swirl of relief and sorrow. They knew the cubs were about to leave them, and although their presence had been frightening at times, they had also sparked a sense of profound compassion. Ella and Noah were in tears, hugging each other. Rebecca felt her own eyes well up as she watched Dr. Miller carefully place the cubs into padded crates. Daniel put an arm around his wife, while Mira stood close by, hands folded. A hush fell over them as they recognized this was the best outcome for the cubs, that they'd receive professional care, a chance at survival. Dr. Miller nodded warmly at the kids. "You two should be proud. Your kindness saved these little ones." She explained that once the cubs were medically stable, they'd stay at Lake Earl Wildlife Rescue, where they'd be rehabilitated until they were old enough and healthy enough to be released back into a suitable habitat. Noah wiped his tears. "But we can visit, right?" he asked, voice trembling. Dr. Miller smiled. "Yes, as long as it's okay with your parents, you can visit them. Just remember, we won't try to make them pets. Our goal is to return them to the wild when they're ready." Ella, tears shining, managed a small smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Soon the family gathered what belongings they could. A second rescue truck would take them back to safety. Outside, the once impassable road had been partially cleared. The sky was still grey, but the wind had calmed, and the heavy snowfall had turned to light flurries, drifting like glitter in the chilled air. Mira lingered by the door. She looked around the cabin that had served as a temporary haven for them all. The broken branch on the roof, the quickly diminishing stack of logs, the circle of blankets by the fireplace, it all told a story of resilience. She watched the family load into a heated rescue vehicle, relief coloring their faces. She turned back in time to see Dr. Miller's crew gently lifting the cubs in their crates. Standing there, Mira felt an unexpected wave of emotion. She thought of her father, how proud he'd be if he could see her saving these orphaned creatures, forging a connection with a family who, just days ago, had been strangers. In that moment she felt a small measure of healing. Daniel stepped out of the truck and approached her. He extended his hand, eyes reflecting genuine gratitude. "We owe you everything," he said. "Thank you." She shook his hand warmly. "I'm just doing my job. You did the right thing too, letting them in." Rebecca wrapped her arms around Mira in a quick, tight hug. "Stay in touch," she said. "Once things settle, maybe we can come back. Let the kids see Redwood National Park in gentler weather." Mira smiled. "I'd like that." Ella and Noah poked their heads out from the back seat, each waving enthusiastically. Mira waved back, heart full. Then, with a roar of engines, the vehicles slowly made their way down the narrow path, leaving behind only tracks in the deep snow. A few weeks passed. The massive snowfall lingered in Redwood National Park, but the worst of the storm was long gone. Park rangers worked tirelessly to repair roads, remove fallen branches, and check on wildlife. Mira often wondered about the cubs, whether they were improving under Dr. Miller's care. Her thoughts also drifted to the family, imagining them returning to their city life, forever changed by their encounter. One morning, Mira found herself assigned to a routine patrol near the Redwood Creek overlook, the same spot where everything had happened. She parked her truck on the clearing and made her way toward the cabin. Snow still piled high, but a few rays of sun broke through the overcast sky, illuminating the world in a soft glow. Upon reaching the cabin, now unoccupied, she inspected the roof repairs that maintenance crews had performed. She stepped inside, where the faint smell of soot still lingered, recalling the memory of the cozy nights spent waiting out the storm. She ran her fingertips across the floor, as if expecting to see the cubs huddled by the hearth. It was empty, of course, yet the echoes of that experience resonated in every creak of the wooden boards. Her radio crackled. "Mira," came a familiar voice. "It's Dr. Miller at Lake Earl. I've got an update on your little orphans." Mira's heart skipped a beat. "Go ahead, they're doing great. Putting on weight, responding well to care. We think they'll be good candidates for eventual release, maybe come spring." Mira allowed a rare grin to spread across her face. "That's wonderful news, Dr. Miller. Thank you." She couldn't wait to share the update with Daniel and Rebecca, or maybe Ella and Noah if she heard from them again. Knowing how deeply they cared about the cubs' fate, it would bring them joy. She ended the call, stepping back out onto the porch. Crisp winter air filled her lungs. The redwoods soared overhead, stoic witnesses to nature's cycles of life and death, survival and renewal. In that quiet moment, Mira reflected on what had transpired. In the face of a brutal storm, a family that had come seeking connection found it in the most unexpected place, a bond formed by helping two starving bear cubs. She herself had discovered once more that healing can come from caring for something beyond oneself. The last vestiges of her guilt about her father's passing felt lighter now, replaced by gratitude for the memories she did have and the life she was living. A gentle breeze stirred the treetops. Snow that had collected on branches drifted down in sparkling motes. Mira closed her eyes and felt the hush of the forest as it breathed around her. She imagined the cubs, safe at Lake Earl, regaining their strength. She pictured Ella and Noah telling their classmates a wild story about how they fed and cared for real-life bear cubs in a blizzard. She thought of Daniel and Rebecca, newly reminded of the power of empathy. Then she opened her eyes and descended the porch, setting off on the trail with renewed purpose. Redwood National Park stretched out before her, vast and ancient, a living testament to the resilience of life. And in the quiet spaces between those giants of the natural world, she carried the story of a snowstorm that had brought people and bears together, a testament to humanity's capacity for compassion, even in the face of nature's fury. And that's where we see the true power of compassion. A fierce snowstorm that seemed to snuff out every hope became the stage for an unexpected bond between humans and wildlife. The family left those ancient redwoods forever changed, carrying hearts full of gratitude and stories they'll pass on for generations. Meanwhile, the little bear cubs found new life in the caring hands of rescue experts, opening doors to a brighter future in the wild. Thank you so much for joining me on this heartwarming journey. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another adventure. I'll see you next time.